courage is a trait, but to get to courage, I think you need to build a certain level of competence through repetition, which then builds the self-belief and the self-trust, which is also known as confidence, which then allows you to start taking those risks, right? To start being a little bit bolder.
Hello and welcome to episode 236 of the Quiet and Strong podcast, especially for introverts. I'm your host, David Hall, and the creator of quietandstrong.com. This is a weekly podcast dedicated to understanding the strengths and needs of introverts along with strategies for success. Introversion is not something to fix, but to be embraced. Normally, we'll air each episode on a Monday. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform. Leave a review or a rating. That would mean a lot to me and help others find the show. Tell a friend about the podcast and help get the word out there that introversion is a beautiful thing. Carlos Garcia is an attorney, Army Reserve JAG officer, and senior trial defense counsel, where he defends soldiers facing military charges. He's also a certified Army resilience trainer, coaching soldiers and leaders on tools to stay calm and resilient. He's the co-founder of True Progress Lab, where he helps people build calm and boldness under pressure so they can shine when it matters most. All right. Well, welcome to the Quiet and Strong podcast, Carlos. Carlos, it's so good to have you on today.
Thank you. It's good to be here, David.
Yeah. We're going to get into the great work you're doing. But first, just tell us a little bit more about yourself and your journey to what you're doing now.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm an attorney right now by trade, and I'm from California originally, and I grew up with good grades. I was really good on paper, and eventually I started realizing all the way from high school, college, law school, post-law school, I was sort of haunted by this notion of imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome, it affected the way I performed. It made me overthink a lot of things. It made me over-prepare and spend a lot of time thinking and over-preparing. It caused me to procrastinate and hesitate a lot, avoid opportunities. And over the years, I came to realize that it was something deeper than that. It was this fear of judgment, if you will, because there's this quote I always think about from this 20th century psychologist. His name is Alfred Adler. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he once said, all problems are interpersonal problems. And when I read that quote, I was like, interesting. And it just made so much sense to me, because if you think about it, you take all, human beings away, we wouldn't have imposter syndrome anymore, right? Because there are no people around.
Right.
And so what that means in essence is that I feared making mistakes in public. I feared being judged by other people. I feared making mistakes, looking silly, looking foolish in front of people, right? And so it was this fear of judgment, also known as FOPO, fear of people's opinions, that was just stopping me from doing things. It made me avoid a lot of things. It made me miss opportunities. And, eventually through accumulation of missed opportunities, I said, enough was enough. So I started engaging in personal experimentation, doing a lot of reading. I became an Army certified resilience trainer in the Army Reserve, training soldiers and leaders. I started doing, combat sports and ultra running. And I realized that I needed to have certain experiences to get out of this rut, this mindset. And that ultimately led me to create True Progress Lab. And now I help people get over that fear. And so they stop missing those opportunities, right? That's kind of in a nutshell.
Yeah. So you're well into your professional career and you're still experiencing this imposter syndrome and fear of what other people think. What was the pivotal moment that you're like, I'm going to do some different things here?
Yeah, I think it was an accumulation of things. really stepping away from the daily grind of working and being overwhelmed with work and competing demands in life, and taking some time to reflect and journal and think about the years that have passed by, and realizing that there was this pattern of me avoiding opportunities that could have been career changing, potentially life changing for me, and trying to pinpoint where all that came from. And through studying and personal experimentation, I realized that it was this fear, it was this anxiety that I was feeling around certain situations that would cause the anxiety, that would cause the fear. And it was that.
Yeah. And also, Carlos, you're a fellow introvert. How does that all play into this? Was introversion something you had to learn to embrace, and what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I know you and I talked about that, and at great lengths before our call. And introvert is interesting because my wife calls me an introvert. Sometimes she calls me extrovert. I don't know. I don't think I am an extrovert. I can be. But being an introvert is so on the MBTI scale, for people who are familiar with MBTI, I'm an INTJ, and I believe you're an INTJ as well, right?
Absolutely. Yep. We're
Yeah,
masterminds.
yeah. And so we're both good at least myself, I would say I'm good at planning, and planning for me is a big word. So if we break down planning, that's organizing, that's reflecting, taking time to see the vision and the big picture. I engage in a lot of just naturally deductive reasoning, going from the big abstract vague picture and then breaking things down to make sense of things, right? And I tend to think a lot in systems. Whenever I'm doing tasks or projects, I'm always thinking in the back of my mind, how can this be automated or systematized so that I don't do it again, right? Or make it more efficient. Also, methodical in working. I try to do things step by step, although sometimes it's chaotic and you have to multitask at times. I'm quite routinized in my ways. I need to have a routine, or else, my life is sort of falling apart. And I'm always in my head thinking, reflecting, trying to find inspiration. And I think that's a strength in INTJs and introverts in general, that we tend to trust our inspiration a lot because we're always reflecting, we're always thinking, right? And so we get, at least myself, I get a lot of my ideas from those moments of thinking, reflecting, and in that process I find inspiration. And then that's when I'm always jotting things down, ideas down. It all sounds good, right? But there's, I think, a negative side to that, being stiff, for example, or inflexible at times, stubborn in my vision. But that's specifically INTJs, I would say. But I don't know. What would you say that about introverts?
Oh yeah, for sure. And let's just break down the Myers-Briggs just a little bit. So it is very helpful saying introvert, extrovert, and that's what I focus on because I feel like there's so much misunderstanding. And I'm always an introvert no matter what I'm doing, but I had some trouble. I was shy and lacked confidence because I didn't understand my introversion. So once I got to know that, I realized how I had to go about things. And some of that is getting over the fear of judgment too. There was some social anxiety on my part too, but it's understanding, hey, you know what? I'm going to think first and then speak. I can do some amazing things because, I related to a lot of the same things that you said about I'm a really good planner and things like that. But it's not all the aspects of our personality. So, like, the next letter is N, and it stands for intuitive because the I is already taken. So, N for intuitive or sensing. And really, it's big picture, really ideas sometimes can come to us without us seeing all the nitty gritty details. Someone that's sensing needs to see those nitty gritty details, and that's really important. Both of those skills are needed. The other thing is thinking versus feeling. So we're thinking, we're looking at the world more logically. Someone that's feeling is actually feeling people's emotions which I don't know why we don't have that gift, but I definitely deeply care about people. It's going to be more mental for me. Like, okay, how can I help Carlos? What's it like to be Carlos? I'm going to think about it versus someone else with the gift of empathy might actually feel your emotions, which, that's not my gift for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And
And I
then the
like,
last, go ahead.
no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, the last one is judging versus perceiving, and it doesn't mean judgment. And you said you need a schedule. Judging is you are scheduled, you do like routines, and the perceiving is more spontaneous. And neither are good or bad. And I often say that that's the letter where me and my wife differ. And she's more spontaneous and free. I need a schedule. We have to work through that sometimes. But
Yeah.
also, we're very happy in our marriage. And it also just on that difference, there's no changing either one of us. Gifts come from it, but understanding that was really important. So yeah,
Yeah.
those e- to me, introversion is being a deep thinker, deep processor. We're going to differ in some ways. It's like over 50% of the population, so we're not all the same.
Yeah.
But I definitely think we have in common that we're deep thinkers. And again,
Yeah.
I always call myself an introvert, even if I'm doing public speaking or podcasting. It's just I've
Yeah.
learned how to prepare and to manage my energy and other things like that.
That's great. And when you mention deep thinker, that makes me think like when I'm working on projects or on team projects, I always like to do my own time to do my own thinking, and then sort of go into the team and then present my thoughts versus people who like to brainstorm and talk it through, right? I'm very much not like that. I can be with my wife. We'll have sessions where we'll talk through things and projects and things of that nature. I've been sort of going more towards that direction, talking things through and sort of brainstorming, right? But my preference is to really think about things and then come prepared. I don't know what you think about that.
Oh yeah. So what I think is there's some people that think every idea has to be brainstormed. And you and I both know that we come up with, like you just said, we come up with some of our best ideas given some time to think. Maybe we're driving somewhere by ourselves and some great ideas come to us. You know, there is value in group brainstorming. We need to be ready for it. We need to be prepared. Like, what's this topic going to be? And some of the best ideas also come from, something, I know something. We don't know the same things. We put our ideas together and that can be great. So what I say is, and when I talk about introversion and extroversion, I use words like generally, usually, because
Yeah,
there's not going to be one set way. But what I
exactly.
say is brainstorming in a group has its place, but also acknowledge the introvert's ability to come up with some great ideas on their own.
Mm,
But you also need to know you're working with an extrovert. Maybe brainstorming isn't your biggest thing, but maybe they really need that from you, even if you don't need it. Maybe they really need to talk things out. And I had a couple on my show, and they talked about how he had a half-baked idea and he wanted to brainstorm about it. And his wife, the introvert, said, she didn't deal in half-baked ideas, and us INTJs generally don't either. We like to share our fully formed ideas. So it's just a difference, and it's important to understand when you're working with people and trying to
yeah,
get some things done.
yeah. No, I definitely see the benefit of speaking before thinking. Versus what we just talked about moments ago, thinking before we speak.
Yeah.
Then there's the other paradigm, which is sort of speaking before thinking, where you're the act of brainstorming, and through that brainstorming process, that half baked idea starts to kind of take shape and take form.
Yeah.
And I do see I definitely see a benefit to that.
Yeah.
There's
And
definitely
that's what
benefit.
I say. We need both. And what I see sometimes is where people get in their head that everything has to be group brainstormed, and that's just not true. But also, I'm not going to come up with all the best ideas on my own. I'm going to come up with some great ideas on my own, but you can benefit from that brainstorming and getting other people's experience and knowledge. And so I say both are important.
Yeah. Yeah, totally agree.
So, Carlos, we also bust myths on this show. Is there an introvert myth you want to bust?
Introvert myth. Yeah, for sure. Introverts, when we're going to meetings, we're going to networking events, and you see that person who's in a corner, and you think, oh, that person must be shy, right? But that couldn't be farther from the truth. It's just a person who's, has nothing to do with being insecure. We just approach situations differently, right? We like to, at least I'll speak for myself, I like to scan and sort of feel the vibe of the area first before just jumping into the deep end. I like to sort of warm myself up, maybe start talking to a few people next to the door. If we're talking about a networking event, I'll start talking to people next to the entrance door. Then I'll make my way gradually and just start warming up. But I'm not just going to go in there and start talking to people randomly. I need to warm up. So I think the biggest thing is, just an example of a networking event, right? Just to put things into context, is thinking that because that person's in the corner by themselves and they're quiet and they're looking around, it doesn't mean that they're insecure or they don't want to talk to anybody, right? It's just how we approach things that are different.
Yeah, and it's okay. It's okay to approach things differently. You got to figure out, how am I going to be successful? And, if I need to bounce from person to person, I can, but it's not going to be that effective for me. I'm going to be better, looking for some great conversations, some deeper conversations. But it all comes back to, what's your goals? Do you need to meet certain people? Do you want to meet certain people?
Yeah.
What do you want? What conversations do you need to have? Do you want to have?
Yeah. I think that's a really important point of figuring out what your objective or your goal is, and it's gonna then lead you to take the right actions, despite any discomfort that you are gonna feel. But if I don't have an objective, then my preference is probably gonna be just hang out with my small circle,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
talk to them. That would be
yeah,
my preference. But if I do have a goal of having to meet 10, 15 people talking, I'll do it for sure.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Tell us about True Progress Labs.
Yeah, so True Progress Lab is a coaching organization that I started from, my personal journey that I shared with you some minutes ago. And at True Progress Lab, we started coaching people, smart people, driven people, but they're just stuck because there's this invisible barrier that most of the time is fear of judgment. Anxiety created from this fear, which is then stopping them from taking that next bold step because they keep getting stuck. They want to get promoted, for example, or they want to make a certain amount of money, or they want to apply for that job. But they have this story they tell themselves about themselves that keeps them from doing that. And it keeps them from thinking the right thoughts and taking the right actions to get to that objective. So at True Progress Lab, what we do is we help people get bold. We help people first build calm in situations like networking, presenting, doing pitches, difficult conversations or conflict, or being in the spotlight as a leader. We help them get calm in those situations. And after they learn to be calm in those situations, then we help them thrive in those situations. We help them thrive by becoming bolder in those situations so that they can show up as their best selves. That's kind of the big picture. So they can go after those opportunities. And how we do that is a combination of nervous system and emotion regulation tools that we use. And we teach people how to use those tools under stress, under increasing doses of pressure, because it's important for people to feel that adrenaline spike, just before you're going to go on stage, for example, and do a TED talk or presentation or be in front of people, you feel that anxiety, right? You need to feel that because you need to become comfortable with those feelings, because if you don't, you're going to panic when it's time to shine. So we give these tools to these people, and then we teach them to use those tools under those pressure situations. And once they start to become increasingly comfortable, then we start to add more discomfort, like the situations that they came to us for help in the first place, like applying for that stretch role or being that leader, that's respected and seen and has that kind of presence. But you need to first build the comfort, right? And you build that through what we do is give them challenges. We give them mental challenges and physical challenges. So physical challenges could be, and we could talk more about this, but just generally, physical challenges are physical exercises that are rigorous in nature. So rigorous meaning it makes you sweat, it triggers certain negative thoughts that will potentially get in the way of you not finishing that last rep or running that last mile, because physical exercise is a really good tool to learn how to manage your negative thoughts and emotions, because it's just you and the exercise, right? So you take out all the variables of humans and it's just you, the road, and your shoes, for example, if we're talking about running. And then we also do mental challenges, which are sort of imitations, or they're scenarios that mimic the real thing at the workplace. So for example, if a person has trouble with being seen as a leader, leading meetings, having those difficult conversations, we'll create those scenarios outside the workplace with increasing doses of pressure, so they learn to become comfortable and confident in those situations. And that with that new self-belief and self-trust, they take that into the workplace and they can shine, right? Because you don't want to learn how to do these things at the workplace. You need to be already bold and confident and have a presence, right? As a leader, you don't want to necessarily have to build that, especially if you're leading a team, right? Like your team is looking to you for guidance and confidence and leadership, right? So,
Carlos, where do you start? Like, I know you talk about a person's story because you talked about their old story. How do you help them develop that new story and look at what their goals are?
yeah, that's a great question. So we have an assessment that we do with people that asks them a range of questions to get to know a little bit more about them, their struggles, their goals, and we get to know what their current values are, what their current mission, purpose, vision is, if they currently have one, because many times they don't. And then we help them create a personal constitution, we call it, or an ethos, which is a 1 to 2 page document that helps them identify what is it that they value, right? What is it that's important to them? What are their purposes? What's their one purpose? What's their second purpose? What do they want? What are they chasing? And why are they chasing it? Right? Because and that becomes their news story. Because people who come to us, they have a story that they've been repeating on repeat, but it's not the most helpful story. And it's the cause of why they act in certain ways or why they take certain decisions. Like we're talking about fear of judgment, right? So many people chase status. They chase money, or they chase job titles, right? And they realize that working with us that they were chasing somebody else's version of success, right? They were too worried about what people thought of them that they're living the wrong thing, and then it causes them to burn out, it causes them to over worry, it causes them to overthink, all these symptoms, right? And so they need to rewrite this personal constitution, this news story, and then not just write the news story, but back it up with proof, with evidence that they are actually living out this new story, right? So that's where the physical challenges come in. That's where the mental challenges come in.
Yeah. And then how do you define courage? What's real courage to you?
Courage. Courage for me is putting yourself in scary situations, being scared, feeling the anxiety and doing it anyway, with the understanding that it's going to be okay. You're gonna survive it. You're still gonna be breathing on the other side. But before courage comes competence, which then builds the confidence, which then makes or creates the room to start taking risks and start being a little bit bolder, a little bit more bold to then have, because boldness is the action of courage to me, right? So courage is a trait, but to get to courage, I think you need to build a certain level of competence through repetition, which then builds the self-belief and the self-trust, which is also known as confidence, which then allows you to start taking those risks, right? To start being a little bit bolder. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
absolutely. And definitely,
It's a process.
yeah, building competence to build your confidence. And I also it you do have to change your thoughts, like you're saying. You can't just all of a sudden have this courage. You have to tell yourself whatever messages that, what am I telling myself, and challenge that, and say, this, I've got this, this isn't scary, this might be hard, but it's a normal thing to go through.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not like you're just gonna have the courage to do, certain things. I mean, you could, but you're more likely to have courage, I think, if you have a certain level, if you have that baseline of confidence, and you build that confidence through the specific situations that you have problems with.
Yeah, I think for me, because you talked about imposter syndrome, I think for me, it was realizing, you know what, I'm doing my best work here. I'm preparing the best I can. But the key for me was I'm not perfect, but
Mm,
nobody is. I could apply that to public speaking. Like, I used to get so nervous, but now I'm like, I did my best preparation. I have an important message to share, but I'm not perfect. I'm gonna think, oh, next time I'm gonna do this. But I
yeah,
remember that in the audience, there's no perfect people either.
yeah. No, I love that you mentioned that the ability to own your imperfections and your mistakes and your flaws. There's so much power in that, because you yourself are admitting and owning to that, and it takes the power away from other people trying to use that against you, because you're already admitting it. You're admitting that you're imperfect, and you have that understanding that everybody has skeletons in their closet. Some people are just really good at hiding them. Like my wife she works in learning and development and human resources, and she's always talking with C-suite people. She's always talking to these leaders who come from these Ivy League schools, have these sexy leadership job titles. And she tells me these stories that I'm just baffled, because it doesn't matter if you're a leader, if you have a certain number of years, it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from. Everybody has problems. And you wonder how they're able to make it so high. They're just able to hide their skeletons. And yeah, like there's this power in just being okay with being okay. It goes back to, I don't know if you asked me this, but a fear of being okay with looking silly, or being okay with making mistakes. Because often the issue of the cause of the anxiety is that we fear making mistakes or looking silly or looking foolish in public. But if we get used to being okay with those things, then they no longer have power over you, right? You become desensitized to the fears, and you're able to then take more risks, right? Because you know that through practice, that if it does happen, you do make a mistake, or you do look silly for a little bit, people are not going to remember tomorrow, because they're so busy, worried about their own problems. or your mind just understands that you're still going to be breathing the next day, right? And many times, 9 times out of 10, those worst case scenario thoughts that you have swimming around your mind, you realize after the fact that it never happened, right? So, but the mind needs to understand that through practice and repetition. The mind needs to learn that in fact is going to be the case, that you're going to be okay on the other side, like the public speaking you mentioned. I was just thinking about that because I used to be the same way. I was terrified of public speaking. I would spend hours practicing, you know and you save a lot of time too from the over preparation. You save hours in the day, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So, are there any other practical steps to help someone get over the fear of looking silly?
Yeah, there's a lot you can do. So the first thing I would say is people need to first understand that that's the problem, right? Looking silly, looking foolish. I would say first figuring out what situations are causing the anxiety. Is it, public speaking? Is it talking to certain individuals? Maybe people who look more confident. Many people have a problem with talking with other super confident people. Is it going to networking events? Like, what is it? And then you have to sort of work backwards. You have to put in the reps. You have to start doing things that are similar in nature to the situation that is causing the fear or the anxiety. And then little by little, you start sort of increasing the stress level. First, if it's networking, for example, you can start by going to the events and just hanging out there first. And then maybe the next day you can start talking to one person. Maybe the next day you can start talking to two people, kind of like that. But you also need the tools to kind of lift you up after you fail, because you're gonna fail, right? You're gonna make mistakes, and that's where the nervous system and emotion regulations tools come into place as well, where you're able to go through that thought process and reflect so that you can stay resilient and do it again, right? So the first thing I would do, going back to your question, is find what is causing the anxiety and then try to replicate that, work backwards and try to replicate that and put in the reps. That's the easiest and most direct way you can start getting those confidence reps in, building that evidence, that self-trust that you can do it. You can thrive in those situations.
Yeah, and the reps are so important. Like,
Yeah.
I started this podcast 4 years ago, and I was confident when I started, but I'll tell you what, you just get more and more confident, and you just get better in your abilities, but you have to start with whatever it is. You have to put in the reps and you will get better. And I'd like to think I was just as good back then, but I probably wasn't.
Yeah, no, that's super, super important. Put in the reps. And yeah, like I was saying, it's a lot of times we quit early too, we'll quit early because we'll try it a few times and then we'll let our thoughts and emotions get the best of us, like, oh, this was terrible, and then you start feeling sorry for yourself. And then all of a sudden you create this story and you say, oh, this isn't for me. But whenever you're starting something new, right, there's going to be friction. There's going to be a lot of failures in the beginning, a lot of pain. And you have to just understand and remind yourself that that's part of the process, that friction, that being terrible at it, and then eventually you start to become comfortable.
Yeah. So speaking of comfort, what do you mean when you say intentional discomfort?
Mm. Intentional discomfort is doing things with your mind and body that are uncomfortable to you, where you allow yourself and you allow yourself to create negative thoughts, where it then becomes your job to regulate those negative thoughts and emotions and learn to push past them in spite of those negative thoughts. So intentional discomfort is a way to practice training how to manage those thoughts that get in the way of you doing what you have to do but don't necessarily want to do to get to your objective, you know? So
Yeah.
whether
So,
it's taking advantage of that opportunity, whether it's applying for that promotion, whether it's raising your hand in the classroom and speaking up, whether it's getting that leadership position that you know you're qualified for, but you just can't get yourself to do it.
yeah. Is that part of the work you do at True Progress Lab, the intentional discomfort?
Yeah, for sure. We do that with the physical challenges. And that's why I said rigorous, because it's not just a couple push-ups and sit-ups. Yeah, we make you go through these physical crucibles where your mind starts to get activated and you start to trigger those thoughts, and where it becomes difficult to do that last rep or run that last mile. But then you have to learn how to push through that, get over those negative thoughts. Because that then it's like I always give the example of meditation. The purpose of meditation is to practice mindfulness, right? To be present in the moment, just very in very simplistic terms. And when you start first meditating, right, you sit in crisscross applesauce, like my son says, Indian
Yeah.
style,
Yeah. Right.
and you
Right.
close your eyes and you sit in a relaxed area where it's sort of dark and quiet. But eventually, the goal is to not have to sit in that way, not have to be by yourself with the lights off and your eyes closed. Ultimately, the objective is for you to be mindful when you're living in the present moment, when you're washing the dishes, when you're having a conversation. And that's the same thing with the physical exercises. You can't expect to do hard things in the workplace if you can't even do finish your rigorous physical exercise, out in the gym or out on the road. If you can't even run 5 miles and get over those negative thoughts of just running that extra mile, it's very transferable. How are you gonna manage to do the hard stuff if you can't even do the simple hard stuff without anybody but yourself? How are you going to be able to do it in the workplace, right? So that's why we do the physical challenge, because it's directly transferable to the workplace. If you can do those hard things with your body and manage those thoughts, you're more likely going to be able to do that and transfer that training that you've developed into the workplace.
Yeah. So in the beginning, you talked about that you did have imposter syndrome and you definitely suffered with overthinking and things like that.
Yeah.
How are you now?
It's a work in progress, every time we go up, up the scale, or we get into a new position and we have new peers around us, there's going to be that level. We're human. We're going to have that imposter syndrome. We're going to feel like we're not good enough. But having the tools to manage that, right? Having the tools to manage those thoughts from getting the best of you, that's what's important, because they're so it's so self-consuming, and it takes so much mental real estate space in your brain. Even when you log off work, you're still thinking about work. You're still thinking about, oh, this person is probably going to think I'm like this or I'm like that. It just takes so much time, and having ways to deal with those thoughts, I think, is super important. So I would say with me, I'm doing much better than before, for sure, because I learned through my work and experimenting that you have to have the tools to get over it. Otherwise, it's going to just consume you and burn you out.
Yeah, and I think, we've been talking about this. I think we just need to remember that we're all a work in progress.
Yeah,
Like I said before, I realized I wasn't perfect. And
yeah,
I'm always trying to get better, but part of overcoming imposter syndrome is I am a work in progress. I don't know everything. And definitely, maybe especially as INTJs, we do want to know everything.
yeah. Yeah, we do want to know everything, because there's a certain reputation you want to maintain, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
not it's not just about, overcoming this fear of looking silly or foolish. I mean, there is a certain limit to that, right? Especially in the workplace. You have, as you go up the ladder, you have certain job titles. There's a certain reputation you want to keep, and people you care about as well. You want a reputation to keep, right? So So with that comes imposter syndrome. You're going to have those feelings, but if you didn't care about them or you didn't care about your job, then you wouldn't have imposter syndrome because you wouldn't care, right? So it's a fine balance between being okay with looking silly, looking foolish, making mistakes, and having to maintain that reputation, and that's where the imposter syndrome, I think, comes. But like you said, being okay with being imperfect, and I think that's what makes a leader a good leader, is admitting to not knowing things, admitting when you don't have the answer to something, admitting when you have made a mistake. And like you've expressed here, like your honesty, and how your honesty with telling yourself that you're imperfect, that has power, right? Because you're being authentic, you're being honest. And I think that's one of the most important things as well, just being honest. And people see that. People respect authenticity and honesty and vulnerability as well, right? And that, I think, says a lot about being a leader if you have those things. So
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that. So often, people in leadership, maybe especially newer people to leadership, think that they can't be honest and show their vulnerabilities and be authentic, and it can seem counterintuitive, but really, that's what people want and need. They want to know who their leader is, and it's okay that they're not perfect as well.
yeah, yeah. I think people, they want transparency. I've had leaders where they would sit down with my team. We would all sit down and have lunch, on the regular, or dinner or events. I've also had leaders where they would never do such a thing. And that says a lot about a leader, I think, because as a leader, you are comfortable with who you are and how you carry yourself. You're not one person to somebody and another person to somebody else necessarily. You're sharing stories, you're being yourself around your team, and then compare that with somebody who doesn't even do that, and they want to have this authoritative perception, or be seen as this authoritative leader. And I much more prefer the other option, which is being able to see a leader for who they are, Yeah, it goes back to just being authentic, being yourself, and being honest.
Yeah, and it's funny because we talk a lot about leadership on the show, and sometimes the perception is you have to be the loud and large and in charge leader, and I don't think most people really want that. And I
Yeah,
also don't. I think, like we're talking about, that they want honesty and transparency and authenticity.
yeah. And they want to see, that you're actually empathetic, not through your words, but through actions, right? Because you can say, oh, we care about you and this and that. I've had leaders who always say things, but they don't back it up with action, like how are you being empathetic towards me? Like what are your actions saying? Are you taking more work? Are you looking out for the team? Like, what exactly are you doing? What are your actions saying? So I think that the empathy part is important as well. Being a empathetic. I always call my wife. She doesn't see herself as that, but I always tell her, you're
Yeah,
an empathetic leader. She
yeah,
has so much empathy, and people naturally gravitate towards her when they need help with something. They see her as a leader, but she doesn't see herself as a leader at all. And I think that says a lot about a leader. Leaders are people who don't necessarily want to be in the spotlight, but they are because they have to. Those are the ones that become the authentic leaders, I think.
yeah. And you bring up such a good point. So yes, that's so key to our teams. Is this team needs to know that you care. But you make such a good point that you have to show it. You can't just say it. You have to show how you care and how you really value, each team member.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to show it through actions. That's exactly right. Yeah. A very good point you bring.
Carlos, this has been a wonderful conversation. We could probably talk for a lot longer. Is there anything else that you want to add today?
No, I would just say, don't take yourself so seriously. Be okay with looking silly. Be okay with owning your mistakes and looking foolish, because that's what's going to be the game changer, not being so stiff and so full of yourself. Let go of your job titles, let go of your status symbols, and start taking more risks.
Absolutely. And I really loved how you said how you paired competence and confidence together. I thought that was really powerful. Keep building your competence, and that will build your confidence.
I appreciate that, David.
How do people find out more about True Progress Lab and the great work that you do?
I'm on X, LinkedIn, IG, TikTok these days. My handle is True Progress Lab, TrueProgress Lab. And my website, you can find me at trueprogresslab.com.
All right. I will put all that in the show notes as well. Thanks again.
Thanks, David. Great talk.
Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you. I hope you take the time to explore other episodes and learn from other amazing guests. Remember, if you're interested in getting to know yourself better, there is now a free Type Finder personality assessment on the Quiet and Strong website. This free assessment will give you a brief report, including the four-letter Myers-Briggs code. I'll add a link in the show notes. And I'd love to connect with you. Reach out at david@quietandstrong.com or check out the quietandstrong.com website, which includes blog posts and links to social media for Quiet and Strong and much more. Send me topics or guests you would like to see on the show. So many great things about being an introvert, and so we need those to be understood. Get to know your introverted strengths and needs and be strong.